Good afternoon. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to the University and the Professor for invitation this afternoon. What I'd like to do is to talk about two elements of competence in teaching, using, learning, assessing languages, and what that means in the context of a European policy of languages. To begin with, and for most of the time, I'll be talking about foreign languages. However, towards the end, I'd like to say something about other languages, second languages, and even first languages. But to begin with, my title, as you can see, is Plurilingual and Intercultural Competences, two elements of a single European language policy. What I'd like to do, in a sense, is to present an argument, in a sense, not just to describe, but to present an argument about how I think, and I think other people too, but it is a personal view, how I think language teaching and learning should progress. And indeed, what I'll be saying is that I think language teaching and learning should be language and culture teaching and learning. That's the underlying point, if you like, but let me give you, first of all, an overview of what I'd like to do. First of all, I'll talk about foreign language teaching as something which is part of social and political activity, and therefore, in a sense, part of social policy in general. Then secondly, I'll come to the question of European foreign language teaching policy and what it means in a European context. And then thirdly, look more specifically at these two elements of foreign language teaching and learning, that is, plurilingual and intercultural competence. Let me talk first of all about foreign language teaching as social or socio-political action. If we think about education policy in general, why do we have schools? What do we do with children in our schools? And to some extent also in universities. But universities have adults and schools have children, and that makes things slightly different. But essentially, for a moment, let me talk about schools. Why do we have schools? Well, one reason is to keep children busy while parents go out to work. But another reason, a more substantial reason, is that we want to shape children and young people as they are and what they might become. So we have an idea of what we want our children to be while they're at schools and what we want them to become during and after schools and universities. So one aspect of this is that we want young people to become, in a post-industrial world, effective human capital. In the industrial world, and in the perhaps pre-industrial world, but certainly in the industrial world, in the 19th century and in the 20th century, developed countries invested in machinery to make better and better goods and thereby create a better and better economy and a state of being for everybody concerned. In a post-industrial world, in the so-called knowledge economy, governments are constantly thinking in terms of human capital, not machinery capital, of having well-developed people. And we have in Britain a programme called Investment in People, and schools, universities, businesses and so on can get a little insignia to show that they have been good investors in people. I think the phrase is quite telling. But another phrase which you can bear in mind from our former Prime Minister, from Tony Blair, at the beginning of his time as a Prime Minister, when talking about what are the priorities of our government, he said we have three priorities: education, education, education. because education is so important. And then on a different, at a different occasion, he made this even more clear. He said, education is our best economic policy. Education is our best economic policy. If you think about that, that's an interesting view of the role of education in society. The second element, second reason for having schooling, is what I put there as having good citizens. Now, what do we mean by good? I suppose we mean citizens who are contented in some way in their society, but are also active. The phrase active citizenship is a frequently used phrase in education for citizenship. And it's always put in terms of, we want our young people to become good citizens of the state, as if there were only one state. If you look at documents, you'll always see reference to the state. In Japan it will be the state, in Britain it will be the state. But of course by the state, they mean our state. In Japan, it's not even necessary, as it were, to say the Japanese state, because the way of thinking about states is dominated by the idea that it's our state must be the only state, as it were. And this notion of the state and the nation state, which has come from the 19th century, is the way that education systems are implanted in the state. So national education systems become ways of creating citizens, good citizens of the national state. And thirdly, but not always, that's why I put it in brackets, a third element of education is to create critical, independent, lifelong learners. Many education policies talk about education in schools and universities being only the beginning, that in a post-industrial society it's important that people become lifelong learners. It's no longer possible to have one job for the whole of your life. You've got to be constantly thinking of being a lifelong learner. But in some cases, that's added to that is the idea of becoming a critical thinking lifelong learner. Now, you don't find that in all education systems, all the documents that I've looked at over the last few years, but it's certainly present in some. Now, if we look at that general picture with respect to foreign language teaching, then we can ask ourselves, okay, so what is the contribution that foreign language teaching can make, or does make, to education and education for the economy and for citizenship and so on? Governments are constantly saying to us language teachers that the reason why they want good language learners is because the economy has become global. In a globalized world, in a globalized economy, we must trade all over the world, and part of that, the qualifications for trading are having good language competences. So in that sense, one can see language teaching as being a contribution to human capital. The second element of citizenship is less frequently stated in documents, but there is a potential contribution for foreign language teaching to contribute to citizenship, but now to take it beyond the idea of national citizenship and think in terms of international citizenship. Maybe international citizens with a national identity. In the document from 2002, which was in Japan called Japanese with English Abilities, which was a kind of statement about why we should be teaching English in schools and universities, you see that there's a focus upon Japanese-ness, Japanese identity, but with English abilities for trading and perhaps also for looking outwards to identification with the wider world. And then there's the critical learners element that is sometimes present in education policy and sometimes present in foreign language education policy. the idea that through foreign language teaching and learning, we can see ourselves as others see us. We can get outside our normal, taken for granted world and see into that world from outside, and therefore become more thoughtful and perhaps more critical about the world which we take for granted, seen from the outside, seen from another perspective, which we get through learning a foreign language. You don't always get that final statement in documents, in policy documents from countries. Some countries it's very clearly stated. For example, in Scandinavia, the documents tend to put emphasis upon that young people should be able to see themselves as others see them. So young people should therefore become more conscious of their own identity and their own state, and perhaps more critical of it by seeing it from the outside. But you don't always find that in all documents, in all countries. Certainly the idea that seeing yourself as others see you can be seen as a means of strengthening national identity as well as giving a critical insight into it. And again, the Norwegians are very interesting in that because they make this very explicit. Learning English, among other things, the reason why we learn English is so that we can have an outsider view on Norwegian identity, but thereby also become stronger in our Norwegian identity. And I think you find some of that in some of the Japanese documents that I can read in English anyway. I'm sure I can't read them all. So that's my kind of starting point, or the first part, is to think about the three elements, I mean there are often more, but three basic elements of education policy: human capital, citizenship, and sometimes criticality in general, and then with respect to what foreign language teaching can do in with those three elements. So, in the second part, I want to look then at the foreign language teaching policy in Europe. Europe is, as you know, not a nation, not a state. But what's interesting is that although it's a supranational entity of some kind, it's an entity which is still becoming, it's still not finished, as it were, maybe it never will be, but in some senses you could see the same or an analogous structure and way of thinking about language policy in Europe to what you can find in nation states. So, to begin with, the human capital element is there too. Why does Europe, by which I refer both to the European Union of 27 states and to the Council of Europe of 47 states? I'm not going to make distinctions between these two to any great extent, because that would be too, well, for one thing it would take too long. There are nuances between European Union and Council of Europe. There are differences, but we can see them as one for this afternoon's purposes. And so I can talk about Europe referring to Western Europe and then the whole of Europe from Iceland to the far east of the former Soviet Union. And in that space of Europe, there is then also a demand for human capital. That argument is there. Why do we have schools in Europe? And it applies to language teaching as well. So from 1995, you find the white paper, which is still, although more than 10 years ago, is still important. You still find this kind of human capital argument. We want people to have proficiency in several languages, because proficiency in several languages has become a precondition if citizens of the European Union are to benefit from the occupational and personal opportunities open to them in the border-free single market. So it's about markets. It's about the European market and by implication also about the ways in which Europeans can trade with the whole globalized economy. So the human capital argument is there at the European level too. But what's interesting, for me, and part of my argument that language is not enough, is that in the white paper, the next sentence says, this language proficiency must be backed up by the ability to adapt to working and living environments characterized by different cultures. So it's recognized in 1995 that the human capital, people, must have language proficiency, but also some kind of cultural proficiency. I would call it intercultural competence, but we'll come to that. So the human capital argument, but also the citizenship argument is present in Europe. From the same document, 1995, it says, languages are also the key to knowing other people. Proficiency in languages helps to build up the feeling of being European, with all its cultural wealth and diversity and of understanding between the citizens of Europe. So, citizens of Europe, this is the European Union, and indeed, citizens of Europe are, within European Union, also political citizens. On my passport, it says at the very beginning, European Union. And then somewhere further down, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So, I am a citizen of the European Union. There is a European Parliament, and I can vote for a European Parliament, just as I can vote for a British Parliament. So it's citizens in that sense, but also citizens in the sense of people who belong to some kind of European culture. And then, as it says in the bit highlighted in red, languages are important in this creation of citizens. Look carefully at what it says. It says proficiency in languages helps to build up the feeling of being European. In other words, there's an implication that there's a cause and effect relationship. That having several European languages, and we're talking about European languages here for the moment, having proficiency in several European languages causes a feeling of being European. Now that's a very strong statement, and I'm not sure whether in empirical terms, whether if we looked at it in experimented and carried out experiments or some kind of empirical work, whether we could find a cause and effect. But this is a policy document. It's not a hypothesis for testing. It's a policy document. It's an aspiration, it's a hope. But nonetheless, it's a very strong statement about why we have languages in Europe, why we have language teaching in Europe, rather. The third element, the criticality element, is not present in this document. There's no focus upon creating critical thinkers. We don't want too much criticism in Europe, thank you very much. We just want good citizens, citizens who feel that they belong to Europe. But it's an additional identity. It's not a replacement for a national identity. It's an attempt to create a new identity in addition to national identity by having, in a sense, symbolically in the passport, both European Union and, in my case, United Kingdom. And in a French passport, it will say Union Européenne and France, citoyen français. But no criticality. What exactly does it mean by language proficiency? Proficiency in several languages was the phrase. Well, it's been put in several formulae. The phrase in the previous statement was proficiency in several languages. When that becomes more precise, then several languages has been interpreted to mean mother tongue plus 2. mother tongue plus 2 other languages. That's a contentious phrase because, and indeed it's a phrase which is not used by the Council of Europe, and sometimes the European Union too, in certain documents, begins to back away from mother tongue plus 2 and just talk about several languages. Because mother tongue plus 2, although easy to remember and therefore effective as a formula, as a catchword, as a slogan, is not easy to put into operation. If you are a speaker of Basque, the language Basque in the north of Spain, and Basque is your mother tongue or your dominant language, let's call it that, then what are the other two? Well, one of the other two has got to be Spanish, because you are a citizen of Spain. That really now only leaves one foreign language. Originally the thought was mother tongue plus 2 foreign languages, but really for someone like a Basque speaker, it's going to leave only one foreign language. And the choice of that is almost inevitably English. So we're not really getting a plurilingual speaker of European languages in that situation. So mother tongue plus 2 has been criticised by certain people. However, let's leave it at that for the time being. So we're talking about language proficiency and cultural competence, that phrase living and working together, which was in the white paper. That's the message, if you like. What we then have in the Common European Framework is a document which describes and puts into operational terms what mother tongue plus 2 and cultural competence can mean in practice. And that's when the terminology, the terms, the words begin to change a little bit. Because in the Common European Framework, rather than several languages, we talk about plurilingual competence and intercultural competence. So that's what I want to focus upon in the third part, which is more, if you like, more technical and perhaps more immediately of interest to people who are language teachers. But language teachers are always working in that political background and in that larger policy framework. So, what do we mean by plurilingualism? First of all, it's a difficult word to say for everybody, but there is a distinction made between plurilingualism and multilingualism. Multilingualism, both words of course come from Latin. Lingua in Latin is language, pluri means more than one, and multi means more than one. Because there are two possibilities, we can make a distinction between multilingualism and plurilingualism. Multilingualism is used in the Common European Framework to refer to geographical spaces, to a country, for example. But it can also be a region of a country, or it can also be a region which crosses several countries, or the borders of several countries. So Japan is a multilingual country. In Japan, there are more than Japanese spoken as dominant languages or as mother tongues. There is Ainu in Hokkaido. There are languages in Okinawa. There are varieties of Japanese, dialects if you wish, but let's call them varieties of Japanese, which I think in some cases are not always easy to, if you come from the north, you don't always understand the south. So in that sense, even if everybody is monolingual, even if every individual were speaking only one language, if the Ainu speakers only spoke Ainu and the Japanese speakers only spoke Japanese, the country would be multilingual. But of course, in a multilingual country, there are both monolingual people and plurilingual people. I suppose in Japan, there are monolingual people. There are probably people who are, perhaps in the older generations, who are monolingual. But there can't be very many, because everybody, or in younger generations, has learned a language at school. So however little or much they can speak that language, they have more than one language. We're not going to, at this point, assume that somebody who is plurilingual speaks all the languages perfectly. Far from it. So even if you only speak, well, Bloomfield said that a bilingual speaker is somebody who can produce at least a sentence in another language, and that person we can call bilingual. Well, in that case, I'm bilingual in Japanese. I've got 3 or 4 words in Japanese, right? And I can produce a sentence because I can say thank you, and that's a sentence. But that may be too minimalist view. On the other hand, if you say being bilingual is being perfect in 2 languages, equally perfect in 2 languages, then you won't find very many bilinguals. We're all somewhere in between. And in that sense, most Japanese, I'm sure, are at least bilingual and probably have more than 2 languages. So, plurilingual competence refers to having more than one language in different degrees. Indeed, who is the perfect speaker of Japanese? Is there someone who masters Japanese completely? I doubt it. I don't think there is anybody who masters English completely. So even in the mother tongue, if you like, or dominant language, one is constantly learning. So it's not a question of being perfect. So having a number of languages, 2, 3, or language varieties, means being plurilingual. And plurilingualism then, to come to the definition now on the screen, is a way of seeing those languages as something simply in your mind. Not as separate compartments in the mind, but as simply language in the mind. So let's just read the definition from the Common European Framework. Plurilingualism does not keep languages and cultures in strictly separated mental compartments. It talks about languages and cultures. I'm focusing for the moment upon languages. We'll come back to cultures. So languages are not in strictly separated mental compartments, but plurilingualism builds up a communicative competence to which all knowledge and experience of language contributes, and in which languages interrelate and interact. So if you introspect, you can see through the ways in which we use our languages, sometimes by so-called mixing, which is criticised, but why should it be? But the fact that sometimes we mix, sometimes when you're speaking one language, a word from another language comes to consciousness, that suggests that your languages are not compartmentalized in practice. And indeed, we should, as teachers, encourage people to see the relationships between languages and how they build up as a language competence. And as it says here in the second sentence, in different situations, a person can call flexibly upon different parts of this competence to achieve effective communication with a particular interlocutor. So if you're speaking, well, I'll give you an example. 2 or 3 weeks ago, when I first came to Tokyo this time, I was in a symposium, as I think has been mentioned, and there were 2 or 3 people from Germany and France there. All of them spoke both French and German. And we were having a conversation about how to get to the nearest station. And although I don't know Tokyo very well, happen to know Tokyo better than they did. Seems a bit strange for me to be telling them how to get to the station, but we were speaking essentially German. But when I was saying, well, you need to go to the next, and then I couldn't think of the word. The word in English is crossroad. So I said, Sie müssen bis zum nächsten Carrefour gehen, and so I introduced the French word for crossroad. Why not? Everybody understood perfectly well what I say, because in that situation we were all French, German, and indeed English plurilingual. So you use the most effective way to communicate. That therefore is being plurilingual, and then we need to come to the question of culture. A couple of pages later in the Common European Framework, it refers to cultural competence. In a person's cultural competence, the various cultures, national, regional, social, to which that person has gained access, do not simply coexist side by side. Again, it's not a question of having compartments of different cultures. They are compared, contrasted, and actively interact to produce an enriched, integrated, pluricultural. I would prefer the word intercultural there, and later in the document intercultural is used. So let's talk about intercultural. Integrated intercultural competence, of which plurilingual competence is one component, again interacting with other components. So what is being said here is that intercultural competence is a bigger concept within which plurilingual competence exists. Now, the Common European Framework is not a perfect document, and I could carry on my lecture by now talking about the difficulties I find in that definition. I won't do that, but but there are problems about various cultures, national, regional, social. What's important is that the idea is that we have inside our minds, if you like, identifications with all kinds of groups. National groups, university groups. I'm sure there's a Kyoto University culture which you get socialized into. Perhaps this last weekend did you have your student festival this last weekend? It was the case in one or two in Tokyo. And as being part of that festival, you're learning to be a student of Kyoto or whichever university. And the newcomers learn to become part of that and identify with what it is to be a member of Kyoto University culture. So you have many cultures in that sense, many identifications in one's mind. So when we then talk about plurilingual and intercultural competence, the Common European Framework goes on to talk in more specific details about what that consists of. And to take intercultural competence first, without going through this in great detail, it defines aspects of intercultural competence, which is, here it's a mixture of the Common European Framework and my own work. Because, as I said, the Common European Framework is not perfect and needs to be improved a little bit. But nonetheless, the important point is that in intercultural competence there are attitudes, there's an element of knowledge, there are skills of interpreting and relating, there are skills of discovery and interaction. Those are the overview. Within each of those elements, one can define more carefully what is involved, and one can then, as a teacher or as a curriculum designer, ensure that the objectives of teaching and learning include, for example, to take just the first one, include activities which create curiosity and openness. activities in the classroom and in learning in general, which create a readiness to suspend disbelief about other cultures and belief about one's own. In other words, activities in the classroom which make learners stop thinking that what other people, stop disbelieving in what other people do, and stop believing that their own way of doing things is the only possible way, and suspend that disbelief and suspend that belief and look at what other people do and think and believe themselves in a neutral, if you like, way. That doesn't mean to say you don't carry out some kind of evaluation or criticism of what other people do. We'll come to that. But the idea is that there's, for a time, we need activities in the classroom which create that sense of curiosity and openness. We need activities which develop knowledge. We need activities which create skills of interpreting documents. This is not by any means all new. We've always, in language teaching, created skills in interpreting documents, whether it's a newspaper or something from high culture, some documents from high culture, from literature or whatever. But the important thing is to be able to link and relate and compare and contrast documents. To look at a newspaper about, is it today or tomorrow, or was it yesterday, the elections in the United States. Look at how it's presented in the United States, if you're a teacher of English, but also look at a document from Japan, a newspaper from Japan, and look at how the same event is seen from different perspectives. That can be done in an English lesson, and a Japanese document can be brought into an English lesson, or a French lesson, or whatever. That's what I mean by what's at the very bottom there, the importance of relating and comparing. I won't go into details on all of them, but what is important is the last one again. I said that there are, in some countries, 3 elements to policy: economic policy, human capital, citizenship policy, and the idea of creating critical thinkers for lifelong learning. That's not present in the Common European Framework. That element of education for criticality is not present in the European framework. It's not present in the European documents. I think wrongly, as it were, because for me, and this is a personal view, education is one of the main purposes of education is to develop in young people a sense of critical cultural awareness, the ability to evaluate, to be critically, but on the basis of criteria that you're conscious of, what other people do, other people's perspectives, other people's practices, other people's products, in one's own culture and in others. The obvious example here is religion. People who teach Arabic in Europe will have issues of different values, different religious values. And so immediately comes to the surface all the clashes in values that are taking place in Europe, in some countries more than others, between some understandings, some interpretations of Islam and some interpretations of Christianity, particularly the extreme ones. That's only an example, but whatever it is one does, whatever one creates, whatever one compares, there's going to be an element of, or there ought to be an element of reflection and criticality. Whether it's what we do in schools, what we do in how we organise working life, whatever it may be, there's always an opportunity which should be taken for critical thinking. But I better move on to what else the Common European Framework does. In that document too, there is then not only the definition of intercultural competence, but also the definition of plurilingual competence, of linguistic competence. things which are perhaps more familiar to people. There's definitions of linguistic competences in terms of lexical, grammatical, semantic, phonological, and so on. Definitions of sociolinguistic competences, definitions of pragmatic competences. So what we've got in Europe is a vision of a policy, if you like, a vision of people being plurilingual and intercultural in their competences. And I think what we've begun to do is to replace a view of language teaching which has been communicative in a narrow sense, where communicative language teaching has focused upon bridging the information gap. That's a phrase that's often used, and exercises are often carried out. And replacing that with words like interaction and dialogue, and with emphasis upon not just communicating information to each other, but using language and cultural competences, plurilingual and intercultural competence, to live and work together. Because that's the way that Europeans, and perhaps other people in the rest of the world, have to be. There is no way around it that our societies are multicultural and multilingual. So in that sense, we have to teach not only plurilingual competences and more than one language to different degrees and in different stages of education over a lifetime, but we also have to teach intercultural competences. Whether that applies to Japan and East Asia is not for me to decide. That's for you to think about. So in that sense, that's my conclusion. All the time so far, I've been talking about foreign languages. I'd like to pass on, for the last 5 minutes or so, to something else. I've called it an appendix, and focused upon second language teaching. This is something that we're working on at the Council of Europe at the moment. There's a focus upon second language learners and seeing them as vulnerable learners. What do I mean by second language as opposed to foreign language? If you are a immigrant or even, well, a long-time resident in Japan, coming from another country, and you're learning Japanese in Japan, then I would see that as a second language, because Japanese is all around you. If you are learning Japanese in an English school, as many children do today, it's a foreign language, because there's nothing around them. Nothing in the environment, it's only in the classroom. Of course, there are two ends of a continuum, because there will be some circumstances in which there is something in the environment. In Scandinavia and the Netherlands, which are countries famed for having good English speakers, it's a mixture. English is not a foreign language. It's almost a second language. It's in the environment. And that's why Scandinavians and Netherlands and the Dutch are very good at speaking English. But I'm talking about second language. That is, and we have a lot of migrant children and children of migrants and immigrants in different parts of Europe, where the national language is in fact a second language for them. Children coming to, young people coming to France from North Africa, and there are many, find French is their second language. But we also want to focus upon all the other languages in schooling, because some children and some young people are what we call vulnerable learners, because even if they are speakers of the national language. So we're trying to look at all languages together. Let me give you Anna and Mustafa. This is something which comes from Professor Krum, Hans-Jürgen Krum, at the University of Vienna. He gives the outline, the black line, empty. And then he asks people, and I've done this with my own students, to fill in the black outline, either one on the left if you're a woman or a girl, or on the right. And in this case, the boy on the right has also put some hair on. And they asked them to fill in with colours to represent the languages that they have in themselves, in their bodies. Embodied languages. And you may not be able to see all the details, but if we look at Anna, I called her Anna. Anna on the left has got, if you look at that she's given a kind of coding for her colours. So she's got yellow Spanish, red or dark red Czech, another red English, kind of violet is German, right in the middle of her body. She's got Croatian in her arms, that kind of mauve colour, and the blue at the top of her body is Slovak. This is Anna. She speaks to some degree, not equally, but she speaks all those languages. She has all those languages embodied in her. And then on the right, we've got, I've called him Mustafa, because I guess he's from Turkey, or at least his parents. I guess his parents are from Turkey. Because his first language at the top is, he's written Türkei, which is Turkey, not Turkish. He's got the one which is crossed out for some reason, must be German, that's red. The next one down, the third one down, is Zigeunerisch, which is Gypsy, or Roma, of the Romani people. Technically it's Romani is the language and Roma are the people. But Zigeuner is the German for Gypsy. And then comes Kurdish, and then Arabic. Arabic is probably something he learns at the mosque when he's learning to recite the Quran. So those are the languages that he has embodied in him. And Anna and Mustafa and all their languages are what we need in Europe to think about when we think about education, language education policy. It's no good just teaching them a foreign language. It's no good just teaching them the national language. It's no good teaching them their mother tongue, because I'm not sure that they know which is which. They're all there, present, and I don't think that really one can talk of foreign language and mother tongue for Mustafa and Anna. They have dominant languages. In some circumstances, one of their languages will be dominant. And in other circumstances, another language will be dominant. In school, outside school, in the street, in the mosque, in the church, whatever it is. Anna will go to church. Mustafa goes to the mosque, I guess. So, what we've got to do in the future, and now I'm talking about work in progress, is to try to have a holistic education policy, a whole education policy, which deals with the existing plurilingualism of Anna and Mustafa and develops it as much as possible, but also creates a new plurilingualism in the way that the first part of my talk was focusing upon, because all the documents in the first part were thinking in terms of mother tongue plus 2 being mother tongue plus 2 foreign languages. And yet for Anna and Mustafa, mother tongue plus 2 foreign languages is a nonsense. They've got all these languages, they've got several languages. Not just 3, they've got more than 3. Of course, I'm not saying that every immigrant child and every child in Europe has got 4 or 5 languages in the way that Anna and Mustafa have, but many have got 2 or 3. Many have got 2 or 3, even if they don't have as many as Anna and Mustafa. So we've got to do something for both groups of people to work. And that's why we need to look at all the languages in education and all the languages which are used for education. And I won't go through all the details of that, but it's a representation of the languages which are present in education, present in the sense that when Anna comes to school, she brings not in, when Anna comes to school in Austria, where the dominant language is German, she brings into the school her Croatian, her Slovak, her Spanish, or whatever. So Croatian is present in the school. Whether it's recognised or not depends upon the way the school reacts. But on the left-hand side, then we've got a list, we've got the group of languages which are regional languages, minority languages, which would be Anna's Slovak, or Mustafa's Gypsy language, as he calls it, his Romani. On the right-hand side are the strictly foreign languages, because Anna and Mustafa will also be learning a foreign language in their Austrian school. And then in the middle, in yellow, are what we call the main languages. You can't call them national languages because some countries don't have, technically speaking, national languages. They don't have official languages. Britain, for example, does not have an official language. English is not the official language in a legal sense. It just is the case that English is used. In France, French is the official language according to the Constitution. So in order to say something about all of Europe, you've got to find a middle way, a phrase like main languages. It's not a very good phrase, but it's got what we've got. Official, national or regional or minority if they're used in education. And then one has to think, well, we need a way of defining, describing and teaching these languages just as we've got a common European framework for foreign languages. And so what we're doing in Europe, in the Council of Europe now, is to develop a project which looks at the teaching of what we call language as a subject. So the teaching of Japanese in Japan as a subject. But also languages across the curriculum. The use of Japanese in Japanese schools to teach physics, geography or whatever. And that second one is just as important. If Anna and Mustafa don't have good German, which is the language of instruction, in physics, then Anna and Mustafa will fail in physics. And if they fail in physics, geography and so on, then they will fail in schooling. They won't do well in schooling if their command of the languages of schooling is not good. So we've got to think about all the languages in school and all the languages that are used for schooling. And we've got different categories of schooling and different languages. Some of them are recognised. Mustafa's Gypsy language, as he calls it, I'm sure is not recognised, if any, in the school that he attends. Recognised in the sense of teachers realising that he speaks Roma language or Gypsy, and maybe encouraging him to learn it more. It's not recognised at all, but maybe one can have it recognised. And there's a great concern then about not just Anna and Mustafa and people like them and how they learn other subjects through languages, but also children whose command of the national language is not good, what we call vulnerable languages. People need an academic competence in language. So in Japan, children of immigrants to Japan, I know there are not very many yet, but there will be, children of immigrants to Japan, they need to learn Japanese, but not only for everyday talk. As Cummins says, there are two kinds of language, two kinds of Japanese, if you like. There's what he calls cognitive academic language proficiency and basic interpersonal communicative skills. And he says that, and think of Japan, think of the future immigrants to Japan and their children. He says that the language of school and of science, the language you need to learn physics in the secondary school, in the college, in junior college and senior college, that demands the performance of other speech acts and discourse functions than in communicating about common topics. Everyday language is easy. Children, immigrants learn everyday language very quickly. And it seems that they're good speakers of Japanese. Well, after a couple of years, they seem to be as good a speakers of Japanese as somebody born in Japan. But transition, as he says, transition from everyday language use to academic language use requires precision, explicitness, rationality, and argumentative structures. It's not good enough just to be able to talk about everyday things if you want to use Japanese to learn physics and so on, or chemistry. Conversational fluency, he says, this is work from North America, is often acquired to a functional level within about 2 years. So a child arriving in a country at the age of, I don't know, 5 or 6, or 3 or 4, or even 7 or 8, within 2 years will be indistinguishable on an everyday level from a Japanese child born in Japan, a Japanese child. But Cummins says, in the last lines, at least 5 years is usually required to catch up to native speakers in academic aspects of the second language. And that's a long time to be lagging behind, being behind everybody else when you're learning chemistry. Let me give you a quick example to finish with. If Mustafa and Anna want to learn chemistry, and let's suppose they're learning it through English, but I think it works in other languages as well. I think it works in Japanese. Take the word reaction in chemistry, which you do chemistry in the secondary school, junior college and above, I'm sure. Now, on a daily basis, the word reaction is something to do with emotions. How did somebody react to an event? What was their reaction to a surprise birthday party? They were happy. So reaction is about emotions. And maybe it's the same in Japanese. However, when you get into the chemistry classroom, you have to do things. You have to set up experimental conditions, you have to do observations and recordings in a certain kind of language. You have to summarize and interpret the data from your experiments. You have to formulate rules and regularities from which chemists can predict that the same thing will happen again in the future. You have to develop and test your hypotheses. And you have to define reaction in a very specific way. There is a reaction between two chemicals. Now, chemicals don't have emotions. It's nothing to do with emotions. But if Mustafa and Anna think that reaction is about feelings, then they will misunderstand the word reaction in the chemistry lesson. Now, it's only one word, and if it were just one word, I'm sure they would quickly understand the point. But it's not just one word in practice. That's only a small example. It's all that goes with it. It's all the use of language to do the things that it says there, carrying out experiments, formulating conclusions and so on. So we think that Anna and Mustafa, but also other children whose mother tongue might be Japanese, but whose control or mastery of Japanese may not be very well developed. So we're not just talking about immigrants, but any child who is a vulnerable learner in terms of language competence needs help across the whole language curriculum. And we've got to find ways of defining what that help is and then providing it. And I keep saying immigrants, and you might think, well, in Japan we don't have any. But I'm told that the Japanese government has a policy to introduce guest workers in the not too distant future. And we had guest workers in my youth, now that's 50 years ago. The first guest workers came to England. Now they are third generation. And the children are still having problems with their language, with their use of English to learn chemistry in the school, or German in Germany or whatever. It will be a problem in Japan too, I'm afraid. And so we all need to think about it. I'm not saying we've got any of the answers, but it's still work in progress. And so I have no conclusions. I'll just stop. Thank you.